All right, y'all, we'll go ahead and get started. I have 6:30 on my computer and 6:25 on my cell phone, and I think it's the one that's slow, so we'll go ahead and jump in. First thing, next Monday, I'm going to have a conflict, so I'm going to postpone that one, but we'll reconvene the following Monday and just keep the schedule as is. And I'll just combine next Mondays with November 29th, which is the origins of Christmas, and throw in some more plant decor with that one. So nothing next week. We'll reconvene on the 22nd for the first Thanksgiving feast or whatever. And we did that one last year, but a lot of people like that. So we're gonna redo that one and the Christmas one. Okay, so we'll go ahead and get in with the historic kitchen gardens. And you've already heard Teresa and I kind of talking a little bit about that. And when you think of the origins of a historic kitchen garden, oftentimes we think colonial. But sometimes folks will think about the Middle Ages or even the ancient Romans and Greeks, because we do have documentation that we know that kitchen gardens actually did exist during the Middle Ages. But we think that the Romans and Greeks probably had a lot of influence on that, because we've got documentation of specific vegetables and even herbs being grown at that time. So it was probably from the early Romans and Greeks through the Middle Ages that kind of stemmed the first development of some of those kitchen gardens. If you've ever heard of French potagers or kale yards, we're going to talk a little bit about that in a few minutes. That's kind of where we start for this evening. Notice here on the timeline that we've got ancient times up to the 16th century, and we're going to go through each century up to today and kind of talk about a lot of those early influences and how we've evolved to where we are today. So just kind of starting out with the ancient times, and some of these are kind of boring, but I wanted to pick out a lot of highlights just to kind of get you ruminating on some of these things. But if we take it way back before Common Era, 2500 BC, we know that we have documentation of farming that was occurring in England. Now, not necessarily gardening per se, but actual farming practices. We know in 2000 that we've got documentation here of our indigenous peoples and Native Americans actually growing corn and beans, squash, sunflowers, and utilizing all those native plants to their disposal for food and medicinal. I don't have medicinal listed here, but that as well. Then in 1495, one of the oldest surviving garden plans is for the garden of a court official in Thebes. And you can kind of see that depicted here. Thebes was actually the capital in ancient Egypt of Wasit, which was one of the, I forgot what they call that, a nome, I think is what they call that. So instead of counties or countries, it would have been the equivalent of a county in Egypt. So it was actually on the east bank of the Nile. Now, Thebes was also the capital of the 11th dynasty and the 18th dynasty as well. So there's a lot of history that takes us back to there. But really what one of the main influences was the pergolas. So we've actually got documentation that show the trellis of vines leading up into the estate. We also have depictions of the tree-lined walkways leading into that. We know that there was rectangular shaped ponds with a lot of waterfowl that was in there. And then there was self-contained wall enclosures, which you can't really see some of those remnants anymore. But we know that because of the highly developed skill that it took to create this, that it had probably been incubating for years even prior to us being able to see this. So probably some of those early designs came along as early as 2800 BC. We know in 1300 that Ramses II had cultivated apples along the Nile River. So remember that apples are not native here to North America, so remember that. 540 BC, we know the Hanging Gardens of Babylon were created. They were built by slaves and peasants under the direction of King Nebuchadnezzar II. And then we've got documentation of Darius the Great in his Paradise Garden, which was in Persia. So this is a depiction of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. This was considered one of the 7 ancient wonders of the world. It was described at that time and still today as a remarkable feat because they just had this, it was like an engineering marvel. They had all these ascending series of tiered gardens. It was a lot of different trees and shrubs and vines. You know, it was basically like this large green mountain that was constructed of mud bricks. So for that time, that was pretty well advanced. Also, just kind of keep in mind, we're going to talk more about this in a few minutes, but think about water even during that time. So we know irrigation wasn't really something that was happening, and certainly not hydroponics, but it was things, some of those practices were being maybe practiced and didn't really know it in its full entirety. So keep that in the back of your mind. We know in 377, we had Hippocrates, the great Greek physician, who is now known as the father of modern medicine. And he was the one that came up with many of the modern herbal remedies that we've talked about in so many classes that have carried through into modern pharmacology. 350 was the gardens at the Academy in Athens, Greece. And then in 322, we had Aristotle, one of the Greek philosophers and scientists, that wrote a lot of treatises or treaties. And basically what that means is just he was knowledgeable in a specific subject matter. But it was at that time that Theophrastus inherited these botanical gardens from Aristotle in Athens. And so all of those treatises then basically came to him, and he was able to continue that exchange of knowledge and keep working on that, because you'll hear more about him later. But this is just a picture of Hippocrates and the Hippocratic Oath we know in modern medicine today. Also in 322, Theophrastus, he was considered by some to be the father of botany. You'll hear some information that might be a little bit different. It just kind of depends on which resources that you read. But for all intents and purposes, he was really instrumental in moving botany forward. Because remember, at this time is when we considered herbal medicine botany. So what we consider botany today was not really botany back then. So remember that too. Exchange of information and seeds and plants between Greece and Persia was starting to take place. So we were getting outside of the comfort zone, if you will, and starting to exchange with other cultures. So you can kind of see here where Greece is at as compared to the Persian Empire. So still pretty close, but we're still getting some movement of those seeds and plants. Y'all have heard me talk about the De Materia Medica, which was what Dioscorus, the Greek philosopher, wrote about herbal medicine. That was one of our earliest instruments, earliest herbals for kind of straight lining herbal medicine today, if you will. And then the administrators of the Roman Empire, about 250, they actively exchanged information. And when I'm talking about information, I mean in all regards, all facets of agriculture, horticulture, agronomy, animal husbandry, even engineering or hydraulics, and then of course botany or herbal knowledge. Again, we know that those plants and seeds were being shared. And then another cool thing to consider, because I didn't really talk a lot about Eastern medicine or China and Japan in this presentation, but China at this same time was taking or making paper from rags and hemp and other fibrous materials at this time. So that's kind of where some of those early advancements came on. Now the Roman Empire, invention and agriculture, we owe a lot to them. You can kind of see there the plows and grain mills and olive presses. A lot of that stuff was taking place. And so we're getting that knowledge exchange that's starting to move outside of those political boundaries about this time. So by the time we get to 760, this is one of my favorites, because anybody that takes my classes, you know, I'm always telling y'all to keep a journal. So you start planning right now for next year, you know, what seeds and plants are you going to plant? You document when the first Japanese beetles show up, when you have cucumber beetles, you can kind of work on all that. So this time of year, you can start planning for what you need to be doing, now and early next year, February and March, to kind of get you prepped up, ready to go. Well, gardeners were doing this back then. So this is when math was kind of, the decimal arithmetic was being used to track details. So cost of plants and materials, there's documentation of that occurring, percentage of plants in a batch of cuttings that they took, any quarts of berries they picked, the supermarket price of green beans and things like that. So there's actual documentation of record keeping that was occurring with farmers and gardeners at that time. We know as we continue moving on up, in 1227, the Vatican Botanical Garden was founded. And that's what they referred to as a medicinal or a physic garden that still exists today, although it's been moved to a different location. And St. Francis of Assisi, you'll see a lot of documentation with him because he was a holy man that's now known for his love of animals and nature and his kindness. And it was a lot of that that helped spur that natural connection with land and people. It really kind of helped perpetuate that existence, that we're all kind of here together and we need to coexist. So a lot of that needs to be owed to him. But this is a modern day picture of that, the Botanic Garden at the Vatican. And then in 1492, we all know that year, that's when Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue from Spain to the edge of the Americas. So notice that next bullet point, that this is when we start seeing the beginning of plant exchanges between Europe and the Americas. Now, when I say Americas, that doesn't mean North America specifically, because note the year there is 1492. So remember, we had a lot of plant exchanges that were occurring, plants being taken from South America back to West Africa or into ports in Europe before they made their way back to North America. So when I say the Americas there, even Central America, there was a lot of that was occurring before some of those plants and crops made their way back to us. We do see herbal used in the Oxford English Dictionary for the first time in 1516. And remember, herbal is not an adjective in this sense, it's actually a noun, which was that manual of medicinal recipes, what the power of plants was used for at that time. This just kind of shows some of that exchange that I was talking about, and you can kind of see it's just this continuous cycle that kept occurring. There's a link on this slide, so you can kind of explore that a little bit better at your leisure. 1530, so just 15 years later, we started having that exchange between Europe and the Americas. So we're starting to see a lot more crops make their way from Europe to North America. This was also about the same time Monartis. I remember bee balm. This was when we talk about taxonomy, Monartis, the plant was named after him. But at this time, he was writing about the botany of the New World, and it was based on all Spanish accounts. So no other cultural or other historical perspective, just strictly Spanish. But that also led the way for the Profitable Art of Gardening by Thomas Hill and herbal medicine. All this was starting to really take place at this time in the late 1500s. And again, this is just another schematic, that link. It makes it interactive, but you can kind of see there just to glance at it where a lot of our plant origins stem from. So make sure you check that out. Like I say, that link is live in there. It's pretty cool to kind of step into that. We know in 1570 that Hernandez, he was a private physician to Philip II of Spain. He came over and explored the New World, and he actually reported on about 1,000 plants that were considered of medicinal value. So basically, I'm leading up to all this. I want you to know what that timeline is, because we have so much knowledge, and especially as you're going to see in a couple of centuries, we're referring back to all this accumulation of knowledge, and that's where a lot of these kitchen gardens come from. So just bear with me for a few minutes. But we also know during this time that the enchanted gardens of the Renaissance, and I'm not very proficient in French, so I'm not going to share with you what the names of those gardens are, but well, I'll try to. Villa d'Este, Tivoli, Villa Lante. That was several of those Renaissance period gardens at that time. And you can kind of see how those are depicted here, but very much aesthetically pleasing to the eye. You can see how some of that incorporation, even with the hardscape and the trees, the shrubs, all of that was kind of coming into play during the Renaissance. We know in 1593, we got the first French botanic garden in Montpellier. And then in 1595, Sir Francis Bacon was preparing a list of all these common garden plants. And we know that that helped lead to a lot of this dispersal of knowledge and that exchange of knowledge again. So floriculture and plant collecting, that become very popular in England in the late 1500s. And y'all have attended several of my classes. You've heard me talk about Jean Girard, that herbal, the general history of plants. That was almost 1,400 pages, y'all. It was a pretty in-depth book. You can still obtain that. It's a pretty cool reference to see how we're going back to the late 1500s to see how that's influenced so much of what we grow and utilize, especially in regards to medicinal plants today. But Sir Francis Bacon, he kind of dubbed himself the father of science. And again, there's a couple of links that are in the PowerPoint that you can read up on a little bit more in depth. But we do know that he was responsible for writing the first account of hydroponic or soilless media gardening. And you see that here on the screen, Silva Silvarum. So he did contribute quite a bit to that and had gone back again to the hanging gardens of Babylon, the floating gardens of the Aztec. There was a lot of influence again with water, and he kind of wrote that all in this culmination of this book. So that occurred right at the beginning of the 1600s. So again, think about the next period as we're starting to see settlers arriving to the New World. You've heard me talk multiple times about how they brought seeds and plants from the Old World, dandelion, calendula, elecampane, a lot of those they brought with them. And they knew that the New World where they were coming, the soil and the land was rich and it would pretty well grow anything. They were looking forward to that, but remember too that when they initially arrived, those kitchen gardens were kind of scant. It took a while before they really got up and growing, if you will. But basically, a little bit of a start there. It was enough to help to get them by for the first couple of years. And not only when they brought these plants with them or the seeds with them from the Old World, they were able to bring treasures from their homeland. And that was one way, if you go back and you look at cookbooks or recipes, if you're lucky enough to find some of those, and I think I've got some of those in the Google Drive from last year, but it was tying a little piece of their homeland and their heritage to this new place that they were living. So that was another thing that kind of made it feel like home for them. So as we move into the 1600s or the 17th century, this is where we get introduced to a few new terms: the potager or the French kitchen garden, the kale yard, which literally means kale yard, which is basically a cabbage patch in Scotland, is what that basically breaks down to. And then our typical cottage garden. So the traditional kitchen garden does come to us from France. It's the potager. It's just a space outside of the residence like you see here. Actually, potager means from the soup pot. So basically everything was grown right outside the kitchen door, on their doorstep. They had it pretty handy. They utilized it all the time. And this type of garden has actually been in existence since like the 15th century. It just kind of made its debut on the world scale a couple centuries later. And you notice there that I had that 15th to 17th century, because we know we don't just stop at a century. We have a lot of carryover and crossover from each century. But when we look at these, the potagers, it was separated from a pleasure garden, okay, because it was all about practicality. It was all about being pragmatic. And notice in this picture that we have stone walls that kind of outline this particular kitchen garden. So oftentimes they would use that kind of hardscape, but they really preferred hedges of plants. And I'll explain that in just a few minutes. Color and form was important, but again, it was more about functionality. And you see there at the bottom, the goal is to make the function of providing food aesthetically pleasing, but the aesthetics came last. And you'll kind of see how that shifts in the next century as we move on through tonight. Also notice one of the things from a French potager garden, I don't know if you can see this very good, but notice how we've got the constructs or the vertical hardscapes here. That was a huge thing with the kitchen gardens during that time. So when you always hear me talking about growing vertical and getting the plants up, they were in tune to that back in the day. They didn't want anything really lying on the ground. Of course, that helps minimize disease and insect and all that good pressure, you know, that we have to deal with today. But they were utilizing a lot of trellis and plant supports back then. Now, when we talk about the live hedges, they would plant with real plants. So you see the white and the red gooseberry there, the medlar. Olive trees were often used, what they called woodbine, which looks very similar to Virginia creeper, wild apples and brambles. So even though they thought it was less maintenance than taking care of a rock wall or any other kind of structure, because they could just go in and prune, weed out, minimize overgrowth or whatever. So they would actually prefer to grow hedges with the live plants. Also with the French potager, they would often use the trellis system like you see here. Often they would use willow branches, and they would construct whatever kind of system that they needed. And they would renew those trellis supports every year, because willow, it wouldn't last typically from year to year. If some of those gardens were lucky enough, they would utilize junipers, but willow is much more prevalent and a little bit more functional in regards to tying those systems together. When we look at the traditional potager garden, it's very similar to what we would look at a kitchen garden today. Notice that I put turnips down here in the corner because often they would have turnips. They would grow those, multi-functional uses. They would even use those to feed livestock on a larger scale away from the backyard or the kitchen garden area. But they would grow those in abundance, and they would usually plant those first because they did take up so much room. And then they would plant coleworts. And remember, wort is that Old English word for herb, and cole crops. Remember, our brassicas we often call cole crops. So that would be cauliflower, broccoli, cabbage, any of those plants at that time. Of course, that plant has evolved over time, and I can't remember the year for all of those different evolutions, from mustard to Brussels sprouts to cabbage. But nonetheless, those coleworts were installed next, and then they would have a path that would lead to their greens, kind of like you see here. And this plant here, sorrel, that was a huge green that they would use. Parsley, spinach, beets, orach, any of those is what they would use. And then from there, they would have another blocked off or pathed off section where they would grow any root crops like the garlics and the onions and the scallions, parsnips and carrots and all that good stuff. And then they would have an area for winter pot herbs. So think about rosemary and thyme, even lavender. That would be an edible flower. So think about edible flowers and pot herbs all kind of mixed together. Hyssop, any of your savories, and lemon balms. This one here is spikenard, and this one here in the top right corner is cosmary. We don't see these two very often in modern day kitchen gardens, but they were used pretty prevalently back in the day for teas. And spikenard is actually related to ginseng. So it was harvested primarily for its root, and it had a very pungent taste. And the Native Americans, because it is native here to Northeast or to Eastern US, they would use that as well for all kinds of different medication and stuff. So there's some links in there for that too, if those are a couple of new plants. But that's some of the plants that they would utilize. And of course, marigolds you see pictured here on the outside. See, that's one of those things that I was saying, Teresa and Patty, when we were talking before, some of those things might be making a comeback because we're starting to see some of those being incorporated again. So marigolds, they would kind of grow pretty prolifically. They would use the juice and the flowers to help soothe eye pain and tooth pain. So it wasn't just about repelling nematodes that we know today. They actually had a functional use for those back in the day. Strawberries were starting to be seen more in these kitchen gardens, and hence strawberry wine, because that too, they would relate that to better eye health. And the berries, let's see, something else. I had notes here. No, anyway, never mind. But then other plants that they had, of course, was asparagus, artichoke. One of my favorites, sow thistle, was included in their gardens. Let's see, I have a picture of that one here. Sow thistle, you notice it looks a lot like dandelion. They are related. but they're both going to be consumed for the same reason. You just notice there, of course, the thistle part, it gets those little spikes on it. I can't remember what this plant here is called. Scarlet. That's what it's called. It's related to the parsley, or it's in that Apiaceae family. It's related to parsleys and carrots. They say that it tastes a lot better than carrots. It's actually a lot sweeter, and you're starting to see a comeback with this plant in Britain. So that's something that we might be fortunate enough to see make a comeback here in the US. But the reason it kind of fell out of favor, and you can probably tell there, I think I've showed y'all pictures of comfrey before. The root system is so complex. Well, the scarlet plant is the same way. It just took up too much space underground. And so that's one reason it kind of fell out of favor. So this picture here is the kale yard, which just again means a small cabbage patch. You can probably see the resemblance there about kale, K-A-L-E and Y-A-R-D, just anyway, kale yard adjacent to a cottage. So it's going to be very similar to the French potager as far as aesthetics and the practicality and the function of that. Again, it's just choosing those plants that are going to be productive. They want to be able to eat those plants when they're fresh. They're not going to utilize any kind of traditional row systems like we see in modern day conventional gardens. They're basically just kind of interweaving them depending on the functionality and the practicality. Just some more snippets from the 17th century. You've heard me talk multiple times about sassafras and how Native Americans loved that plant. They would utilize every part of that plant. And we know that that was where saffron come from. That's where our first root beer came from. We also know you grind up the leaves of sassafras, that makes the filet gumbo in Cajun food. But we also know that in the early 1600s that it was very, very popular in England. So we're starting to see a rise of that. So we know that there's some crossover and knowledge exchange going on there too. Also in 1621, that's what this picture here on the right is going to depict, is brides that were being imported from England. So it was at this time, 57 women were brought from the old world to be wives, but this one in particular, her name was Alice Burgess, and she came with a note that said she knew how to brew beer. Okay, so that was actually starting to take place here in 1621. So we're going to talk about the first harvest and some of that stuff, the Thanksgiving feast and all that at the Plymouth colony in a couple of weeks. But this was something I did not know prior to today. So it's really interesting, the story. I don't want to give it all away, but make sure you go in there and read that, because I had no idea that that was actually taking place at that time. It didn't really go into specifics about if it was hops that they were brewing for the beer. I don't really know, but nonetheless, that was taking place at that time. In 1630, Constantinople became a city well known all over Europe and all over the world for its flower gardens. Now, of course, there is no edible use really necessarily to the tulips, and we know that the tulip bulb came to us from Holland, but it was Constantinople, which is now Istanbul in Turkey, that really took hold of the tulip bulb and started implementing those. So this is modern day Istanbul. Those remnants from Constantinople's past still carry forward in that tradition and culture. It was in 1638 that we know the honeybee was introduced to American colonies. So a lot of good things starting to occur in the early 1600s. Notice that boring picture there of just salad greens. Well, it wasn't until 1646 that they actually started utilizing greens in a mixed salad. And so that was at that time they would take other vegetables and add to it whatever they had growing in their kitchen garden, which I thought was kind of cool. Now in 1686, here in America, the kitchen gardens were starting to kind of take shape, and kind of what you see here on the right is what they call an astronomy garden. Okay, this is actually Aquarius. So if that's your star sign, that's kind of what an Aquarius garden would look like. But they were based on astrology. So that actually occurred from 1600s all the way into the 1800s. They would use raised beds. They would fence those to keep the animals out. So that's kind of what some of those early depictions, if you ever hear that, it's going to be synonymously used as a kitchen garden. It could be an astronomy garden. So that kind of leads us up to the 18th century into the 1700s. And remember, we've got a lot of crossover. A lot of things are starting to go on, especially here in America. We know that in the 1700s, those colonists were relying on productive home gardens strictly for survival. So beauty's out the door, anything aesthetically pleasing, any kind of, prettiness gone. Okay, it's all about survival. So that's where we get those small enclosed dooryard gardens, kitchen gardens, astronomy or astrology gardens, right outside the front door or the back door. And that's where all those culinary and medicinal herbs and vegetables and edibles and all that good stuff was grown. So you kind of see a picture here depicting that, easy to get to. Of course, you usually will use that adjective colonial to kind of describe that. Pioneer, early settler garden. There's some distinctions, and I've got some links in here that kind of break that down a little bit more. But for tonight, to speak more to the colonial, bear in mind it was usually about an acre. So again, let's transport ourselves back to that time and think about what the farmsteads and the homesteads were at that time. Huge plots of land that the men are out working the livestock, and they were growing grains and fodder to feed the livestock, and they would have several acres to manage. Well, that left the women folk and the children at home to manage this like 1 acre garden. Well, again, think about the time that it would take us to do that today if we're watering that in July and August, especially if they're having to, lug up out of a well, or if they're having to tote buckets from the creek or the river or however they were watering. So it really took pretty much all day to be able to take care of that kitchen garden, let alone weeding and of course harvesting at regular intervals. So just a lot of work to that. But that's another reason it was just outside the home. They also would incorporate these raised rectangular beds. Notice there I put sound familiar with walkways, because we're seeing that now with raised beds. And if you remember some of the herb talks or that I've talked about raised beds, that actually comes to us from medieval times. The Romans were implementing that years or centuries ago. But anyway, they would use these rectangular beds, or they would mound them up, whatever they could get to use. They would try to pivot that to where they could have water runoff, good drainage as well. When we talk about veggies and herbs, remember they brought a lot of those from the old world, just reiterating that. So think a lot about our heirloom vegetables today that we love. Those have been handed down generations to generations. So some of those are still in use today, or some of those have actually been lost, unfortunately. But when we think about goals for those colonial gardens, it's all about growing for food, medicine, and seasoning. So if there happened to be a plant that was pretty, that was great, but that's not what the main use was for. So we're going to take a look at a few, and I'm going to share with you why they thought those plants were important. So this is horehound, and was largely used as an expectorant or as a tonic. It was given for asthma or any kind of major bronchial type issue. It was actually utilized as a poison to withdraw poison. So if anything that they deemed as a poison, that could be a snake bite or anything else that they deemed as a poison, this was the antidote poison to withdraw that other poison. It was considered an anti-magical herb, because if you were bit by a wild dog or a wolf or anything like that, that too was considered the antidote to get that individual better. But we still see horehound today. It makes candies. It's a good flavoring agent, still largely used. This plant here is Angelica. Some of you have heard me talk about Angelica because it was said in the Middle Ages that a monk had a dream and an angel told him that this plant could cure the plague. So that's kind of how Angelica got its name, from the archangel that delivered that message. They still make a tea utilizing the leaves and the roots of this plant. The seeds and stems were used again in any kind of bronchial ailment, pleurisy. It was also used to calm the nerves. Notice the stalk there, they're typically hollow, but within that hollow stem resides pectin. It's a natural pectin. So they would chew on that to help aid in digestion. And then they would boil and cook the stems and use those to flavor Christmas puddings, candies, and other desserts. And you can actually candy these stems today. There's a recipe in the Google Drive to show you how to do that. It's pretty flavorful. It's pretty good. But they would also extract oil from the roots and from the seeds, and they would use it to flavor liqueurs like Benedictine. And then they would also use it for bitters. And remember bitters, when they would make Angelica tincture, bitters were used to help stimulate digestion, much like dandelion greens. But they would also use Angelica to flavor tobacco that they smoked in pre-rolled cigarette days. So it would impart that sweet flavor. This plant here is winter savory. Both of these pictures are winter savory. Now we have two savories, winter and summer. The winter savory was looked upon a little bit more favorably because it was a perennial. The summer savory is going to be the annual counterpart to this plant. Notice it's got a little bit of a woody stem, and it can kind of, if you grow this plant, it can get a little out of hand. So you kind of have to give it a haircut every now and again. But both summer and winter savory were used as a diuretic. They were used as an antiseptic, much like thyme. They have those natural antiseptic properties. And then if you got bee stung or stung by a wasp, then this was used as the antidote to draw that poison out. This was used for flavorings in pork or any kind of wild game that would take a lot of that gaminess out. It would help mask those unpleasant odors of any of those colewort crops. So think about cabbages. And then today, the summer savory is often used as a salt substitute. So if salt's one of your issues, summer savory might be one of those to look into, but you can use it to flavor green beans, any kind of vegetable like that. Or we got Thanksgiving coming up. If you've never used savory in dressing or stuffing, it's a pretty good addition to your thyme and your sage. This plant, we've not talked about this plant a lot in other classes, but this is lady's mantle, and this was what the female colonist would use for ladies' issues, any kind of ladies' complaint. And the reason these plants, if you chop up those leaves, they've got a lot of tannins in those. Remember, tannins are what kind of make you pucker. That's what gives you the chewiness when you're drinking red wine. But anyway, there was a lot of tannins in that, so they used that as a blood stop agent, much like the Native Americans would use yarrow. During the Middle Ages, the lady's mantle plant was associated with the Virgin Mary. And then if you notice the leaf, the reason that it got the name mantle was because the leaf looks a lot like a cloak or a mantle. So it's one of those that's highly revered, not as much here, but especially in English gardens. And speaking of Thanksgiving with sage, we know in ancient days that sage was thought to relieve any kind of mental disturbances. They used it to aid in digestion, and they also used it to eat and to smoke to lengthen lifespan. Okay, the Romans also used it as an aid in contraception, and then at a later period, it was helped to cure snake bites. They would use multiple plants to draw out those poisons. It was so highly revered that even the Chinese would trade green tea for this plant once its known prevalence became known to them. Native Americans would mix sage with bear grease, and then they would make a salve to treat sore throats with that. So that just doesn't sound too appetizing to me, but anyway, they really thought it was a cure-all for sore throats. This is hyssop. You've heard me mention hyssop several times because this is the one that really smells medicinal, and that's why it was used as a strewing herb. They would strew it on the floors. It would help absorb odors, but they would not only use it at home, they would use it to clean temples and other holy buildings. So they considered it very sacred. Anytime you step on this plant, it would release that fragrance. Now that fragrance is very camphor-like. So if you've ever crushed the leaves of hyssop, you know what I'm talking about. Because it was so medicinal, it was used to help with any kind of breathing ailments. So they would take a salve and rub on your chest. So think modern day, what is that stuff they rub on your chest that stinks so bad in the little green tub? Y'all know what I'm talking
Vicks
about.
Vapor Rub.
Thank you. Yes, modern day Vicks. Yeah, okay, y'all know what I'm talking about. But they would also extract the essential oil, and they would use that in liqueurs like chartreuse. Again, they would use it in bitters, and then still used today for perfume. Now remember, it smells like camphor, so but I guess back in the day, anything kind of went. Calendula, y'all know I talk about this one quite a bit. This is Calendula officinalis, and this is what we also call pot marigold. So the Romans grew calendula not only for their beauty, because that bright, vivid orange pop, but they used it for scorpion bites. And the early Christians gave the name of the Virgin Mary to any plant that they thought was beautiful. So the plant was once called gold, G-O-L-D-E. And then marigold, and then finally marigold or pot marigold, and that's where the name kind of derives, and it distinguishes itself from the marigold species that I showed y'all a minute ago, the tagetes. This is calendula, so that's how it got to be known as pot marigold. So now you know. But pot marigold, calendula has been used to stop bleeding. It's got great antiseptic properties, so it's been used for dressings for wounds. The ointment was still utilized during Civil War times, helps with fevers, digestive issues. The petals are used for dye. You can see there it makes a very vibrant color. We know we can use the centers and dry those out to make poor man's saffron. So lots of different uses for calendula. They would actually use this also for flavorings for dumplings and stews, puddings, and wine. And it would also, if you use the blossoms, of course, impart that orange color. Again, Calendula officinalis is one that was used pretty regularly, grown in those kitchen gardens. But Calendula resina, if this is something you're wanting to grow at home, that's the one that has a little bit more of the medicinal pungency, just as an FYI, but very closely related. This is wild marjoram, or what we know today as oregano. So in ancient days, it was used to cure an upset stomach or consumption, scurvy, jaundice, toothaches, any kind of swellings, any kind of headaches. And the Greeks and Romans would actually create little wreaths and put those on young couples' heads when they got married. They would plant it on grave sites because they said that promoted happiness and peace as you left one world to the other. And it was used in cooking the same way that marjoram was, but you don't see oregano. If you go back and look at cookbooks and stuff, you won't see that as prolifically as you see the marjoram, because they didn't like the flavor of the oregano as much as they liked true marjoram, if that makes sense. Nasturtium is another one that's really vivid and bright. These actually originated in Peru, and they were brought by the conquistadors to Spain in the 16th century. The name nasturtium actually means nose twister. So if you've ever smelled of a nasturtium, then you know why. It's very pungent. The leaves have a really nice peppery flavor. I love pepper, so I love nasturtium leaves on a salad because it gives you that without having to shake on the pepper. The leaves are really tender before flowering, so you can eat those as well as the blossoms. If you harvest the seed, then that's a good substitute for capers, and those were utilized all year long. This is borage. This is also known as bee bread. So I learned that tonight or today or yesterday, whenever I was putting this together, but I've never heard it called bee bread before. But the reason for that is because bees are the only ones that can pollinate this plant. So this plant, all parts of the plant are edible. They all taste like cucumber. Even back in the day, they would utilize the star-shaped flower as a candy, or they would float it in beverages. They would use it as a happy herb. So anytime somebody was feeling depressed, they could give them borage and it would instantly lighten their mood. This plant here is tansy, or sometimes called fernleaf tansy, and it was used for the treatment of roundworms, and it would also help with digestion. So if If you remember, I think in one of my classes, I talked about embalming. The early Egyptians were some of the first to utilize plants to embalm, and tansy was one of those. So one of the first presidents at Harvard College was buried wrapped in tansy in 1668. And when they exhumed him in 1846, they found him to be perfectly preserved. And they said that was tansy that helped to do that. Tansy is a bitter herb, so it's going to have a really bitter taste. So it's not often used in cooking. Very, very sporadically, a little dabble do ya, like just a little smidgen, because it's even more bitter than dandelion, believe it or not. But when you typically hear about tansy, it would be at Easter, and they would actually make Easter cakes or tansy cakes to be symbolic of Passover, because it was such a bitter herb. In colonial times, they would hang tansy in kitchens because tansy will repel flies and mosquitoes and ants. So if you grow this plant in your garden, it does spread really rapidly. So contain it in a pot, plant the pot underground, or, plant it away. Or even if you cut those sprigs and let it dry hanging upside down, typically a sprig or two of that will last like 3 or 4 weeks. And it really does help repel ants, just as an FYI, I've used it before. In medieval England, it was strewn on the floors to help ward off insects, and then it's still used today in making liqueur chartreuse. Very bitter herb. This one here is spearmint, and we all know it's very fragrant. The Romans have always used mint since the beginning of time. They would use crowns of mint on their head. They would put sprays of mints on tables at their gatherings because it did smell so good. The Roman ladies would chew it to purify their breath, and then they would use it in their baths just as a general restorative. Also been said to reduce nausea and induce sweating. And then the oil, of course, that we have become so fond of today is what is used to make chewing gum and candy and all that good stuff, and toothpaste. And then our wild violets or sweet violets, many consider these a weed, but we know even our Native Americans love the violets. Our early settlers loved the violets. They would always include this in their kitchen garden. It was actually the ancient emblem of ancient Athens. And the Romans would wear garlands of this plant because they thought that it would banish being hung over, and it would help dispel a headache. They would also make tinctures out of this to moderate anger and to induce sleep. And then the oil, they would use that to make a perfume. It is one of the most fragrant flowers still today. It's been used in potpourris and sachets for many, many centuries. And then of course the flower, you can candy those as well or float those in drinks. So really pretty addition to the kitchen garden. This plant here is Dianthus, otherwise known as pinks, otherwise known as clove pinks, as gillyflower, or as border carnation. So it has a lot of different names, and they've been popular for over 2,000 years in herb gardens just because of their attractive flowers. But they are also used to impart a really distinctive flavor to wines and to ales and syrup, sauces, and jams. And it's always used as a substitute for cloves and potpourri. So again, with fall coming on, I'd like to try that. I've never known that to be a substitute for cloves, but I think that would be kind of cool to try that out. This was used, or the English think that this plant actually came from the region of Normandy. Many people think that this plant originated in England, but they claim that it did not. So that's just some of those early plants used in the kitchen garden. As we continue on the timeline, just a few more things to make mention of. You see there on your right-hand side is the Gardener's Dictionary that was written by Philip Miller. And he was the head of apothecaries in Chelsea, England. So we started seeing more sharing of knowledge. And you notice there the word cultivating, some of those words are starting to come into play here in the 18th century. And then here on the left, this was actually the mother of King George III. This is the Botanic Gardens of Kew. So she actually incorporated these on her private estate, still in existence today. As far as people in the 1700s, we have Bartram there in the lower left corner. He was the botanist to the king, and he was the one, you've heard me mention him several times. The Bartram Trail is named after him. We see roads named for him all the way down into Florida. But basically, in a nutshell, he's the one that introduced all the native species, the native plant species, and really encouraged those to be planted on homesteads and farmsteads, even at that time. It was in 1773 that he started collecting all these plant samples and actually sharing plants from this area with territories in Europe. So that's another way of how some of that knowledge exchange was taking place. There on the right, that's Carl Linnaeus. So when we think about modern day taxonomy, he was the one that created botanical classification that we all know and love today. But that's kind of when we started seeing more of an organizational standard botanically for plants starting to emerge. Some of you heard me talk about the Shakers. They have different, or they had different sects in New England. There was one in Harrodsburg, Kentucky. But it was in 1784 that they were the first people to sell garden seeds in little paper packets in the world. And you can see some of those little paper packets there on the right. So that's kind of cool when you think about it. The Farmer's Almanac was first published by Robert Thomas in 1792. I couldn't find a 1792, so I used the 1793 here. But at the same time, Nicholas Appert, who was a Frenchman, was the one that started sharing preserving techniques. So modern day canning that we know today actually came from the French. So as we move into the 1800s or the 19th century, notice there that 75% of the population in America was directly involved with agriculture in some form or fashion. So 3/4 of America's population at the turn of the century in 1800 involved, in agriculture. What am I doing? I'm rolling the thingy. Sorry about that, guys. It was also at that same time, a man named John Chapman, otherwise known as Johnny Appleseed, started planting apple trees in the Ohio Valley. And we all know that's who we owe for apples becoming so prolific and popular here on American soil. Notice in the corner, a Little House on the Prairie. I like this website, so I've got you a link to that. They've got some really cool information on pioneer gardening or settler gardens. So make sure you check that out, because it was in the 1800s, we know, as those settlers were starting to move west. And oftentimes for this part of the world, it was through that Cumberland Gap that Daniel Boone kind of blazed the trail for us. But remember, practicality is going to be the mainstay again here. It's the gardens are staying close to the door. It makes it easy to maintain those plants. It makes it easy to protect the plants, kind of like you see here. Again, flowers took a back seat to productivity, to efficiency. Again, these kitchen gardens were the domain of the women. So they're the ones that kind of designed this. This is just a schematic to kind of showcase what may have been some of that mentality or that thought process. This is where they would actually hoof up soil to drain off close to the house. They would actually use what they called the four corners approach. So once they got soil mounded up and actually got it, they would amend it. Where they felt like it was fertile, they would take timber stakes and put in the four corners of that to kind of hold that soil in place for the rest of that year. They didn't have access to well-rotted manure like their European counterparts, because think about it, they've been pasturing livestock herds over there for a lot longer than what they had been here. So they didn't have a lot of that. So that's where a lot of that exchange of knowledge came from Native Americans and utilizing fish and eel as that fertilizer food initially with some of those early pioneer colonial gardens. At this time, you had two influences. So starting out there on the right, the Native Americans, thing to remember there is they were incorporating strategic combinations, implementing those, very practical and pragmatic approach. Often looked at today as being very ingenious and working in tandem together. Those plants were working in tandem. So think about three sisters. Okay, we have the corn stalk or the sunflower, you've got the beans and the gourds or the pumpkins. Everything served a purpose. It was just very much pragmatic. Whereas at the same time, the other influence would have been 17th century garden writers. And basically those kitchen gardens were being dictated by fragrance. And what do I mean by that? So think about all those sweet smelling plants or flowers. They would plant those directly under the kitchen windows. Whereas things that smelled really bad, again, the coleworts or the cabbages or the garlics and the chives, all that, they would plant away from the kitchen windows so they wouldn't waft in. They would grow perennials out separately. They would never combine perennials and annuals, again, just for root systems. And they would install hedges, living hedges, both in the perimeter and out of the perimeter of those kitchen gardens. Whereas as opposed to that, Native Americans, think about the three sisters, you'd have a couple of corn stalks and it'd be like little teepees here and there. So you had these two different approaches, and we start seeing this mingling starting to occur. Think about 1826. That was when Thomas Jefferson, our first gardener, kind of came on the scene. He journaled everything. There's still records, historical documents that reflect all the work that he did. This is actually taken a few years ago at Monticello. These gardens are incorporated and still maintained today. Also at that same time, Robert Stein was inventing and patenting methods of distillation for liqueurs and spirits. And then we were starting to see apple orchards, formal apple orchards starting to appear in Canada and in New England. As we move along, we start seeing some other influences. So in 1841, it's the Ladies' Companion to the Flower Garden. So basically, instead of it just being a pragmatic approach, let's incorporate flowers to have for the prettiness, the aesthetically pleasing to the eye, the scents and the smells and all that good stuff. The first fair in America was in 1841 in Syracuse in New York State, and then the Irish potato famine began also in 1840. So we had a lot of things that were going on worldwide. 1848, you can probably tell what this was the beginning of, what we know today as the cottage gardens. And you can see those water paintings, just how pretty those really are. Very informal kitchen gardens, still a lot of those in place today. As we move on into the mid-1800s, Ephraim Wells Bull actually developed the first stock of Concord grapes. That's what you see pictured here. Just a few weeks later, or a few years later, Thomas Gregg wrote the Handbook of Fruit Culture. So we're starting to see more of that take shape. Central Park, you see the plan there for Central Park, designed by Olmsted and Bow. Okay, and you'll hear more about Frederick Law Olmsted here in a few minutes, but he was a huge advocate for urban green space, even in the mid-1800s. He was really pushing that at that time. And then in 1862, we also had President Abraham Lincoln signed into law the creation of the Department of Agriculture and called it the People's Department. So 1862, USDA came into existence, as well as the Land Grant or the Morrill Act of 1862. And that was when Abe Lincoln granted every state a land grant institution of higher education learning. So that's where University of Tennessee, University of Kentucky, North Carolina State, Mississippi State, all those land grant institutions came into play in 1862. In the mid-1800s, we start seeing some shift. Home gardening becomes more of a leisure activity, because that's when villages are starting to grow. We're starting to see communities expand and produce markets are starting to open. Edible gardens, they fall out of favor. Ornamental gardens, they take center stage. U.S. plant breeders, we're starting to see more genetics starting to take place. We see more research being conducted in diseases and in pests more than ever before. Many of you know Harriet Beecher Stowe. She and her sister wrote this American Woman's Home, and basically you would liken that to, I guess, an anthology of cooking and gardening and canning, all these skills for the the American homestead woman to utilize during that time, even how to entertain and all that good stuff. So it became really big at that time. And then in 1888, you notice there, that's when the Brandywine tomato was bred and created. So lots of shifts occurring. 1894 was when Burpee introduced iceberg lettuce, and Luther Burbank created the Idaho russet potato. So you can kind of see how we're leading up into the late 1800s. We're starting to see those gardens move from that back door or the front door, and they're starting to take, you know, a backwards going, you know, far away from the home, going out into the backyard or to the side door where you can't really see it. They were replaced with these stylish maintained grasses that we know today as lawns, and some don't like lawns. Some are trying to get away from lawns. Some really are funny about their manicured lawns. It doesn't matter which way you fall, but just telling you, it was late 1800s. That's when lawns become a little bit more prevalent, as did those professional garden designers, and started to want to have more of a private area in their landscape versus the public, as it had always been before. So you can kind of see moving away from the backyard or from the back door and just moving into the backyard, trying to separate living space and functionality was kind of what was going on. To look at some historic 19th century gardens, Monticello is a great one to look at. Old Sturbridge Village, that's up in Massachusetts. That's late 18th century. It's about a 200-acre working village. Stratford Hall, that's in Virginia. That's the historic home of Robert E. Lee. So a lot of those practices, you can see those there. And then Strawberry Bank up in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. All of those are real indicative of what those gardens and some of those transitions are, where we're starting to see that transition occur. Remember, in the 1800s, we were growing heirlooms. Hybrids really hadn't come into play. Remember that there was no commercial seed trade. Remember, so we're still doing this locally within our communities, and we're actually starting to swap more with the Native American people as well. Remember, no refrigeration existed, and everything was organic because we didn't have synthetic fertilizers and chemicals at that time. Okay, so I just want to point that out because you can kind of see kind of how we're rolling along on that wheel. We're kind of coming full circle. Oftentimes too, especially like with master gardeners, if we're trying to incorporate a period era garden and we're trying to find exact cultivars or varieties or species of plants, oftentimes that's hard to do because some of those, we can't find those, or they don't exist anymore. So as you're doing research, just be aware of that. Some of those just may not be available anymore. So as we come into the 1900s, this is where Frederick Law Olmsted comes back into play. This is when Biltmore House was built, and we see those extravagant gardens. Still today, we can go over there and visit anytime and kind of see how that kind of influenced gardening at the turn of the century. And again, just remember, he was a huge advocate for urban parks and green spaces right up till the day he died. In 1904, a couple of big things happened. The American Horticulture Society was formed, and then who knows what those trees are on the right? Anybody want to guess? Everybody's muted. I don't know if y'all are talking to me or not.
Redwoods.
No, it's not. It's not redwood. That's our American. It's American chestnut tree.
Chestnut.
And that was the prize tree of the forest, especially here in southern Appalachia. But that is when the chestnut blight came in and pretty much decimated our American chestnuts. But you can see chestnuts were used pretty much for everything on the farmstead, homestead. So it was really sad to see those populations go. As we're into the early 1900s, we see that interest in edible gardening, it's dropped because what's happening? We've got manufacturing jobs that are drawing Americans to urban areas. That's where we start to see that shift, that gardens become more natural looking. That's where we get those softened lines and landscapes that just kind of connect and flow with our lawns and our landscapes. Nothing is really necessarily succinct anymore. We start seeing some of those trendsetter landscape designers and architects. They actually do start utilizing native plants a little bit more prolifically. Often before, they were just considered to be weeds. We'll go back to sow thistle, prickly little sow thistle, but they actually started in incorporating some of those in native landscapes at that time. I put this up here just to depict science, because the big thing that was occurring in the early 1900s was just record-breaking amounts of scientific advancement and research was taking place. Because, at the same time, we had the Land Grant Institution formed in 1862, and then we had the Hatch Act that gave us the creation of the research centers as a component of that land grant institution. And then extension was created. All of these are interconnected, still are today, but all of that stuff kind of came into play, and we have all of this knowledge being shared, all these institutions in each one of these states. And so there's a lot of links that was embedded. That flashing thing was getting on the nerves, so I moved ahead. But there's a lot of links in there about all the scientific advancements that were taking place, or just books that were being written that were helping infuse a lot of this influence all over the U.S. at that time. So when we think about 1910 to 1930, what we were getting then were the new garden styles from England. So think about England. You see all these plush perennials, huge, like you see pictured here, just large billowing beds of perennials, less maintenance, but you get these outdoor living spaces. The outdoor living room is, making a comeback. It becomes really in vogue. Lawns are actually starting to become more manicured. They're becoming larger. And this is where we're getting into those, the foundational plantings, the huge mass shrub plantings, especially close to the foundation of the houses. That's where all of that came into play, was 1910 to 1930. Something that happened in 1916, our favorite critter, right? The Japanese beetle. He appeared in New Jersey. He came in on some imported nursery stock. So that's when he launched his attack on us. 1933, we had the Depression, remnants of that. So the Ag Adjustment Act was established, and that was basically to give price supports to our farmers during the Depression. That same year, we had vegetable and flower varieties began the competition for All-American selections that we still know and love today. So 1933. 1940s, that was when World War II brought us back to the veggie patch, as they say. Urban areas, the community gardens started being created, basically took on a new life. This was when President FDR was telling every American household to fight those food shortages with a home garden. So 1943 became known as the year of the victory gardens, and that's kind of where that came into play. And in essence, many will account that is a backyard kitchen garden, but FDR wanted Americans to grow those gardens to cut food costs. And you can kind of see some of those posters utilized at that time. In 1950, think about agriculture in general, not necessarily our kitchen gardens, but think about ag in general, because it did influence gardening. But everything was done with a horse back in the day, right? But 1950 was the year that tractors outnumbered horses for the first time ever. So for some, that seems like that year was really far off. And for some, it's like, wow, that was just like yesterday, when you really think about it and put it in perspective. So again, a lot of technological advances in regards to farm equipment. I didn't go into the ag side that much, but I did want to point that out. But think about the cotton gin, moldboard plow, all of those type things were really coming along after the turn of in the 1900s, early 1900s. By the 1950s and 1960s, it brought a couple of chemicals that you probably have used in your gardens. Daconil, which is a fungicide, or chlorothalonil is the active ingredient. And then 7 or carbaryl is an insecticide. You often will hear extension agents. If you're conventional and not organic, we will often recommend these as a first line of defense. So these were introduced in the 50s and 60s just to make gardening easier. About 10 years later, you had the introduction of Rachel Carson in Silent Spring. She wrote the book and was doing a lot of research to prove that ag chemicals were very negative on wildlife, especially eagle eggs, mammals, amphibians. And so later in 1972, the Federal Insecticide, Rodenticide, and Fungicide Act occurred, and there was a lot of changes that occurred as a result of a lot of her research. Oops. In 1970s, this is when we had our first Earth Day. So first big celebration. This is when we really start to see an uptick again of home gardens. People are wanting to grow gardens again. They're wanting to incorporate those edibles back into their landscape. There's an uptick in community gardens, wanting to be able to provide those victory gardens, even though they're not necessarily termed victory gardens at that time. You're still seeing that influx in community spaces for community gardens. And then organic gardening, getting back to the basics, because you kind of saw that trend. We had some of those chemicals created, synthetic fertilizers were being created, but we're also having research on the other end of that spectrum to show that that might not be the best thing for the environment. So you're starting to see very slowly in the mid-70s an uptick of all of those occurring. Also in the 1970s, just some other things that are happening. Weed eaters were introduced. Remember, our lawns are getting bigger, so we got to have other equipment to utilize. The first certified organic gardeners organization was created in California. And remember, organic, if we had been utilizing chemicals, we had to have a 3 or 7 year plan to get out of that ground. Nothing could have been utilized on it. So California was the first to create that certified program. The Heritage Roses Group was formed. Seed Savers Exchange in Iowa was organized in the 70s. And then permaculture was pretty much born from the ideas of David Holmgreen and Bill Mollison. And that just continues to grow today. But it was in those mid-70s, again, gardens we start to see taking on multiple personalities. So in the 80s, gardens become extensions of the home instead of just separate entities or areas. Those outdoor rooms, they're back in style again. Xeriscape, that was a new word that was coined for landscapes that contain water-wise plants for dry climates. And then low maintenance, drought tolerant native plants become more prominent. And we're starting to see that all of those things still carrying over even to today. Moving on into the 90s, small space gardening soared because urban populations are doing what? Fastest rate in history. Nashville population was growing by leaps and bounds, fastest growing U.S. city a couple of years ago. I don't know if it still is, but you know, when you get all those people, there's a lot of infrastructure in place, you know, a lot of houses, land that's being developed. So you can't have a lot of space to grow out for gardens. You got to think growing up for gardens and be creative in that. So that's where we've seen a lot of that rooftop gardens, a lot of those things coming into play with permanent planters built into hardscapes, small private urban spaces, and a lot of modern day apartments, what do they call those, townhouses and condos that are being built, actually have a lot of these already built in place. And that's what's really selling some of our younger generation to purchase those, is because they have a lot of those permanent planters already in place, or green space in place. So when we look at 2000 and beyond, and I promise we're wrapping up, but edibles are back to the forefront. Y'all know that because we've been doing a lot of those classes for the last 2 years. We're starting to work on, I know Darby was on here a few minutes ago, my colleague in Giles County. She and I are both on the fruit and veggie team, and we're working on novel fruits for 2022. So y'all are going to see some more of that stuff come out from our statewide push on some of that. But edibles are back, and that's just because we're all more health conscious and we want to know where our food comes from, kind of making its way back to the farm. Notice there in 2009, the White House planted the first garden since World War II. So we've gone several decades without that being implemented. By 2013, we had 1/3 of all American households reporting growing food. So that was huge. And as we kind of wind up, finishing with this schematic, because what have you seen from that huge timeline? We're just making this huge, big, full circle. So kind of like we were talking about at the very beginning, we're starting to see maybe some of those concepts from yesteryear. Some have greatly influenced where we're at today. Some have been maybe negotiable as to why we are where we're today. But when we really take into account and perspective and look at all of those different strategies and implementations from the beginning of time, it is really cool to look at that and see, you know, our historic kitchen gardens, how they started, their function and their use, and how they've moved to what to what they are today. I mean, I think even in these classes for the last 18 months, listening to y'all and watching y'all, it seems to be there's a push to get back to that, you know, and I think a lot of folks, even if we're just planting kitchen herbs in pots on our patios or on our back porch or on our deck, they're there, they're within reach, you know, we can nab them and grab them when we need them, you know, and I think that's kind of where we're coming full circle, and we're seeing all of that today. But remember, again, next week we don't have class. We're going to be back together on November 22nd. That's when we're going to do the harvest celebration. So we'll go into more detail about Plymouth Colony. It's going to be the same that I did last year, but nonetheless, like I said, I had a lot of people that liked that and wanted to sit back in on it. So I hope I'll see you on November 22nd. And then the next week, we'll do the origins of Christmas. So make sure you join in. That link will work. If you're here tonight, that same link will work for those next two classes. So I hope you enjoyed tonight. I hope you got a little something out of that. I will share the video and resources and all that good stuff with you tomorrow. And if you know, I realize I did not send the link to y'all last week. So I will just put both of those together and send that to everybody tomorrow from last week and tonight. So you'll get all of that good stuff. So sorry about that. But y'all have a good week, and I will see you in 2 weeks. Thanks, y'all.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Melody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Melody.
Thanks.